even though the technology has enabled us to prevent the ultimate consequences of the act, that hasn't, I don't believe that mitigates the seriousness of the interaction. And I think the fact that we've lost that has damaged intimate relationships almost beyond repair by making the part of them that is most significant emotionally and physically into something that's now as trivial as the lightest of entertainment. I don't think it's done us well, and that, obviously that's quite a conservative position in the political sense, but everything I see going on around me seems to point to...
Conservative or rational? I'm not being cute. Why is it conservative? Conservative might be prescriptive, but what you've described, I read over and over in left-wing sources, in progressive sources, how many depressed young women there are in the culture of our what is it called again? The
hookup.
The hookup culture.
Yeah, right.
Very few people would say that this has benefited women.
Well, I also see in the left-wing culture there's this strange splitting of attitude towards sexuality. And so on the one hand, there's this proposition that every possible variant expression of sexual desire and action is not only permissible, but to be celebrated in a mandatory manner. But simultaneously, every single interaction that's even vaguely sexual between a young man and a young woman is so pregnant with danger, so to speak, that it has to be reduced to an explicit contractual arrangement before it can even be undertaken. And so I think the fact that both of those exist, those tendencies exist on the left simultaneously, the left being that part of our political discourse that tends toward the breaking of arbitrary constraints, that's an indication that there's some underlying set of regulating principles that's been violated. You get an excess in libertinism on the all sexual proclivities are to be celebrated front, and the simultaneous legalism that emerges, because that does put young women in the in uncomfortable situations that are extraordinarily hard on them. So you get questions arising, for example, well, can a young woman give consent to a sexual interaction of any sort if she's intoxicated by alcohol? And it isn't the right-wingers who are bringing up that issue fundamentally. It's the left-wingers, and their answer is, well, no, absolutely not.
That's a contradiction of tectonic proportions
absolutely.
within that worldview.
What it isn't a contradiction with, though, is this.
Yeah.
I mean, this is not reciprocal. This is this is saying that if I don't see here an equal and opposite commandment. If a woman entices a man to sleep with him, then she's
forced to marry him. Right?
No, this is the view here is that men have an absolute responsibility not to engage in commitmentless sex, and that to do so is to take or do something that is not reciprocal, and you know. So conservatives who want to point out these hypocrisies in the left should have to grapple with whether they are prepared to speak a kind of truth to power to men and say, this is intrinsic to your masculinity, is to take responsibility in this regard.
There's that famous documentary that came out recently, What is a Woman? And there's actually a biological answer to that question. There's a multitude of them, but one of them is, maybe you could say this, that's the principle of the biological reality, is that the female is that sex which takes primary responsibility for reproduction and bears disproportionate weight in doing so. That's what constitutes female, and that's true right at the level of sperm and ova. And it propagates, it's fractal. And so the reason it's the man that's taking advantage here is because the price he'll pay for it is nowhere near as high as the price she'll pay for it, either emotionally or conceivably practically. And so it is fundamentally his sin, right? And I think it's very much...
The confusion in the young, I mean, so I work in a very odd kind of college. It's a good one. But we figured out that the kids don't understand much about sex. And so we started offering a course called The Theology of the Body. And it is the most popular course on the campus now. And, you know, we're having to recruit half the faculty to teach it. Because
using the teachings of John Paul II?
yeah, such things. You know, in other words,
yeah.
it's they understand sex is very consequential, right? It's a big thing, and in what way is it a big thing? And how should you, because they want it, they're human. What is its purpose? And all of that, right? And it's not enough to say, because like we're talking about details here that are almost romantic, because the preciousness of a woman, we teach the young men, don't foul that. That's a wonderful thing, and they, listen, it's good for them.
Conservatives like to talk a lot about the hatred of men and the diminution and the problems in the education system. They're completely right to do so, but we really have to ask. I mean, to what extent some of it is a consequence of the abdication of fundamental responsibilities?
Yeah, well, I think it's not only an abdication of fundamental responsibilities. It's also a diminution of the pleasure principle itself, because I don't believe that it's unreasonable to make the presumption that there is no more sacred act than sexual congress in some fundamental sense. And then what that means is that to diminish that to the status of light entertainment is to take the thing in your life that could be among the highest and to make that nothing but that which is casual. And that means there's no increment on the hedonic side at all, quite the contrary. And I would say I think part of the evidence for that seems to be that more and more young people aren't having sex. They're not engaging in relationships. Well, they're not having sex with another person. I mean, pornography use is rife, although even there's now evidence that among young men, the proportion of young men who have zero sex, which includes even the use of pornography, has started to climb up dramatically. And so it could easily be that we put ourselves in a situation where making sex as freely accessible as possible and as casual as might be imaginable has actually demolished its hedonic utility as well as its integration within a broader set of moral constraints.
This may be very obvious, but if you take your view, which I agree with totally, there's a way towards that, and this is safeguarding. In other words, the young man who's done that hasn't gone through the betrothal and the dowry and all that sort of stuff. So it's a protection of the very ways that the Jews saw you had to approach marriage.
Isn't there also a sort of philosophical, anthropological paradox that some of the most animal aspects of human life are also the most distinctively non-animal at the same time? So, for example, the meal. No other animal has a meal. And they feed, but they don't have a meal together. So for us, the meal, it's no accident that in great religious traditions, a meal has profound symbolism. The Eucharist is one that springs to mind, but there are many others, of course. Exactly. This is the sacred. And isn't it also true with sexual relations that this is at the same time the most animal, and yet it's a point where we distinguish ourselves from all other animals, and it's precisely, I think.
I think that's an extremely wise point, also because it is the case that it's easy for the pull of our animal nature to entice us into a state of profound self-consciousness and shame. And that frequently happens, and I think it happens more often, to women who sleep around casually. And we could extend that to women who sleep around casually when they're intoxicated by alcohol and wake up the next morning and think, well, just what the hell did I do? And the shame emerges. And then you might say, well, what's the antidote to that shame? And it has to be perhaps that the pull of that animal nature has to be balanced by the sacralization of the enterprise. And that is the way, and that's the way out of the shame. And hypothetically, when you read about sexual utopian communes, for example, what's lurking in the background consistently is this idea that we could just, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could just dispense with our shame of nakedness and with our sexual shame? And the proper response to that might be something like, well, you can't dispense with it. The best you can do is integrate it into a subsidiary structure and elevate it, and it's through the elevation that the shame is eradicated, but not as a consequence of the mere dispensation with shame, which isn't, I don't think, unless you're psychopathic, I don't think it's possible.
One little additional thought. I have spoken on campuses by sheer coincidence on some occasions, not most, but on some. It was Sex Week, which virtually every American campus has. I assume Canadian campuses have as well. And the campus is sort of drenched in sexual discussions, exhibitions, et cetera. And
I'm naive. I never heard of Sex Week.
Well, you're at Hillsdale.
You're at Hillsdale, yeah. There's no sex week at Hillsdale.
Yeah. But if Hillsdale has Sex Week, invite me. And it was a little depressing, actually, and I think it became clear, I'm certainly not prudish on the matter, which sadly one always has to add when one discusses sex, which is a tragedy in and of itself. But in any event, I'm just thinking, and this is a wild thought, would the average student on an average campus be happier if there was a Bible week or a sex week? Just in terms of happiness.
Mm-hmm. So, I would also like to point out on the clinical front, just for the sake of argument, that there are markers of antisocial personality. And so that would be a proclivity towards the exploitation of others, the criminal exploitation of others. And that's a pretty stable pattern of behavior in human beings. It tends to last across the life course. It's very difficult to moderate with any psychological or sociological interventions. And there's a cloud of symptoms, patterns of behavior and thought that are associated with criminality, exploitative criminality. Predatory parasitism is the most extreme form of criminal proclivity. And one of the hallmarks of antisocial personality is multiple early sexual partners. And so the criminal types tend to engage in short-term mating strategies, and what that means is that they don't integrate their drive towards sexual gratification into any subsidiary structure. There's no long-term commitment to themselves or to other people. And I think that's very interesting that is a hallmark of antisocial personality, because it makes you wonder then if the group of persons who is pushing hard for a kind of naive sexual libertinism on the grounds of hedonism, if that's also not expressed, under what circumstances that's also not an expression of this same kind of callous exploitativeness that's a hallmark of antisocial personality. It's a perfectly reasonable technical question, because the more civilized people, the ones who are farthest from criminal behavior, are those who are more likely to engage in stable, long-term, monogamous relationships. Mm-hmm. And that's clear. That's another example of this bottom-up propensity, right? There's a biological reality there too, because you might say, well, the biological reality is that we're propelled by our lust, the biological drive, but it's way more complicated than that. There's also a drive towards the integration of sexuality into a higher order pattern of being that's much more stable and much more likely to be reproductively successful, for example. So psychopathy is 3% of the population. It's not a great reproductive strategy. It works better than it's better than not having sex at all. But it's not a good long-term stable reproductive strategy.